There was a cold, almost antiseptic brightness in the chamber that morning, the kind that made every movement feel exposed. Justice Samuel Alito sat rigid in his chair, adjusting the fold of his robe with the careful precision of a man who needed every detail to look immaculate. The cameras were trained on him, but he looked as if he hardly noticed. After all, he'd spent decades believing the robe itself was a shield, an untouchable symbol that deflected doubt. Jasmine Crockett knew better. She'd waited nearly 40 minutes as committee members droned through prescripted niceties about judicial decorum and precedent. Every time she glanced at Alito, she caught that faint curve at the edge of his mouth, a smirk that suggested he considered this all beneath him. When her name was finally called, she didn't shuffle papers or clear her throat. She simply leaned forward, placed both hands on the table, and spoke in a voice that was low enough to make the room lean in to catch it. "Justice Alito," she began evenly, "you've spent years lecturing the American public about the importance of judicial integrity. So I'd like to ask you, when exactly did that integrity become optional?" A hush fell. Even the C-SPAN cameras seemed to pause. Alito's eyes narrowed slightly. "Congresswoman, if you have an allegation to make." "Oh, I have more than allegations," Jasmine interrupted, her tone steady as stone. She held up a folder thick with photocopies and underlined reports. "I have records, donations, correspondences, travel receipts. And if you'd rather not address them here, I'm sure the public will be very interested in hearing them read aloud." Somewhere behind her, a staffer swallowed hard. "This committee," she continued, "has been told again and again that the court is above suspicion. But let's be clear, when your personal benefactors are the same billionaires with cases before your bench, that's not just an appearance of impropriety. That's a conflict of interest so glaring it could blind the rest of us." Alito shifted, one hand closing around the arm of his chair. "I will not dignify." "You don't have to," Jasmine said, lifting her gaze to meet his without blinking. "Because the facts dignify themselves." A ripple of low murmurs broke through the gallery. And in that moment, it no longer mattered how many decades he'd worn that robe. Jasmine wasn't asking for permission to speak. She was there to remind the country that no title, no matter how exalted, could erase the truth. For a moment, the silence in the chamber felt like a vacuum, the kind that pulled all the oxygen out of the air. Samuel Alito's face, usually a mask of remote authority, was tight around the eyes now. He opened his mouth, likely to issue some practiced rebuke, but Jasmine raised her hand slightly, not to interrupt, but to signal that she wasn't finished. She flipped open the folder, her thumb finding a marked tab with quiet certainty. The rustle of paper somehow sounded louder than the camera's shutters. "Let's start with something simple," she said calmly. "In 2019, you were the honored guest at a retreat hosted by Horizon Strategies LLC. That same year, Horizon Strategies filed an amicus brief in a case your opinion later decided by a single vote." A flicker of something, recognition, annoyance, or maybe dread, crossed Alito's face. "You never disclosed that trip," she continued. "You never recused yourself. You never even acknowledged the connection." He leaned forward, voice clipped. "Congresswoman, the Code of Conduct." "The Code of Conduct doesn't exempt you from transparency," she shot back. "Unless, of course, there's a page I haven't read. And I assure you, Justice, I've read every page." A wave of quiet reactions rippled through the hearing room, a reporter mouthing, "Oh my God," to her colleague, a young intern nearly dropping her pen. Jasmine didn't flinch. She turned to the next tab in her folder. "You've claimed repeatedly that the court should remain above politics. But this," she said, tapping the documents, "this isn't about politics. It's about honesty." She looked him square in the eye, her voice soft but relentless. "You sat on a bench and called lawyers unprincipled for hiding the truth," she said. "You wrote opinions lecturing ordinary Americans about ethics. So tell me, when did the rules stop applying to you?" A hollow beat passed between them. Alito tried to reply, but whatever words he had rehearsed didn't come out. His jaw worked silently for a second, and his gaze darted, not to Jasmine, but to the cameras trained on him. That was the moment Jasmine knew she'd found the crack in the armor. She leaned back in her chair, never breaking eye contact. "This isn't personal," she said. "It's public. And the public deserves answers." And as the chair recognized the next speaker, every eye in the chamber stayed locked on Alito, who for the first time looked like he no longer believed the robe could protect him. The next congressman tried to pivot, some question about precedent, a soft reprieve meant to let Alito recover his composure, but nobody in the room was listening. All the oxygen still hovered around Jasmine's words. Alito folded his hands over the table, knuckles white. For years, he'd spoken to Congress with the tone of a man untouchable, certain that no one would dare challenge his credibility. But Jasmine had just pulled back the curtain, and the audience could see the man behind it, a man whose silence now felt less like dignity and more like evasion. It was in that stillness that Jasmine did something that would be replayed 1,000 times before sundown. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She just opened her folder again. "I'd like to clarify for the record," she said, her voice level, "that this is not conjecture. These documents." She held up a page so the cameras could zoom in on the header. "Come from publicly available filings, subpoenaed communications, and sworn statements. I'm not making allegations. I'm reciting facts." A few rows back, a reporter scribbled furiously in a spiral-bound notebook. Alito finally managed to find his voice. "Congresswoman Crockett, the Supreme Court is an independent body. We are not beholden to the whims of public opinion or political theater." "That's right," Jasmine agreed, not missing a beat. "You are beholden to the Constitution. To the public trust. To ethical standards you've spent decades telling the rest of us to uphold." She didn't look away. "So let me ask you plainly, Justice, is there any circumstance, any at all, in which you believe a justice should disclose gifts, trips, and financial ties to individuals with business before the court?" Alito's lips parted. He seemed to search the ceiling for words that would sound measured, unbothered. And for a moment, Jasmine thought he might simply refuse to answer. But the cameras were rolling. The staffers were watching. America was watching. Finally, his voice low, he spoke. "It depends on the context." A hush spread like a tremor. Jasmine tilted her head. "The context is simple," she said softly. "You accepted favors. You ruled on cases involving those same benefactors. And you never told the public." She let the sentence hang in the air, a judgment without a gavel. "Justice," she said, her tone almost gentle, "integrity isn't contextual. Either you have it or you don't." No one dared move. Even the chairman paused before calling time. And Jasmine closed her folder, her face perfectly still. For the first time in a very long time, it was Justice Alito who looked small. The chairman's gavel came down, but it sounded hollow, more an attempt to break the spell than an assertion of order. Even as the next speaker began their question, some bland inquiry about judicial precedent, no one was really listening. The reporters were still locked on Jasmine, their pens scratching out the same headline in a dozen different ways. She didn't need to say more in that moment, but she did anyway, because sometimes the most important thing isn't just exposing hypocrisy. It's naming it so clearly that no one can pretend they didn't hear. She leaned back toward her mic. "Justice Alito," she said, voice level as ever, "you've had ample opportunity to clarify these relationships voluntarily. You could have issued statements. You could have recused yourself when the American people might reasonably question your impartiality. But you didn't." He didn't interrupt. Maybe he knew any objection would only confirm that her words were landing exactly where she intended. "So I'm going to put this on the record one more time," she continued, her gaze sweeping the chamber, "so no one in this room can claim later that they were unaware." She opened the folder again. On June 14, 2019, you attended a private dinner in Jackson Hole with representatives of Western Energy Holdings. That same entity filed a brief in State of Montana v. EPA, decided in 2020. You authored the majority opinion. You did not disclose this connection. She paused. On October 22, 2021, you accepted travel accommodations from the Leonard Foundation, which has spent millions in coordinated legal strategies to challenge federal environmental protections. You also failed to disclose that trip. Her hand never wavered as she turned each page, the documents a litany of receipts no rhetorical flourish could erase. Your defenders will say this is an attack on the institution, she said quietly. But the truth is, the only thing that destroys public faith in the court is when its members act like the rules don't apply to them. Alito's face had gone a shade paler, though his jaw remained clenched tight. For a fleeting moment, Jasmine thought she glimpsed something in his expression, not just irritation but something closer to fear. And maybe that was the point. Because she wasn't there to trade barbs. She was there to show the country that even the most powerful man in the room can be held accountable, if someone is willing to say what everyone else is too afraid to. She closed the folder at last. Integrity, she repeated, her voice soft as a knife sliding between armor plates, isn't something you declare. It's something you prove. And this time, no one, least of all Alito, had anything to say. A clerk cleared his throat, the sound brittle in the charged quiet. Another representative tried to reclaim the room with a question about procedural reforms, but every eye was still fixed on Jasmine and the folder now resting in front of her like a quiet threat. Even the cameras seemed unwilling to pan away. Justice Alito shifted back in his chair, fingers drumming once against the polished table before going still. For the first time, his gaze flickered, not just to the chairman but to the rows of spectators lining the back wall. Jasmine knew what he was searching for, a sympathetic face, an ally ready to step in, to smooth over this moment as a misunderstanding. But no one came. She had made sure of that. Because the truth didn't need embellishment. It only needed enough light. Jasmine didn't move, didn't smile. She simply watched him. You know, she said finally, her voice softer now but no less certain, when I was a public defender, I watched judges lecture defendants about accountability. About how consequences were the inevitable result of choices. She leaned forward, her elbows resting lightly on the table. You taught the country that justice is blind. But you've treated transparency like it's optional, like it's beneath you. And that's the part no one here wants to say out loud. A ripple of discomfort passed through the committee members. Some looking down at their notes, some pretending to straighten their nameplates. Alito's lips pressed into a thin line. You've made a career out of demanding integrity from everyone else, she continued, her tone like a scalpel, but the minute someone asks you to live by the same standard, you hide behind the robe. Her eyes didn't waver. I don't care if you call it disrespect, she said. I call it consistency. For a long moment, no one moved. The hum of the cameras, the quiet shuffle of staffers, even the distant sounds from the hallway, everything seemed to freeze. And then Jasmine did something no one expected. She slowly closed her folder and set it aside. I'm done with questions, she said calmly. The rest of this country can decide for themselves what your silence means. The chairman cleared his throat, trying to reassert control. Thank you, Representative Crockett. But Jasmine spoke over him, her voice steady, unhurried. And just so we're clear, she said, this isn't about partisanship. It's about whether the people sitting at this table believe they're accountable to anyone at all. Her gaze swept the room one last time before she leaned back in her chair, folding her hands neatly in her lap. And when she finally went quiet, the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was reckoning. The chairman hesitated before moving to the next speaker, almost as if he feared the air itself might shatter under the strain of Jasmine's last words. In the back row, a woman from Reuters was typing so fast her nails tapped out a nervous rhythm. One of the aides standing against the wall had tears in her eyes, not because of any single line, but because Jasmine had said out loud what so many were too intimidated to even whisper. Justice Alito exhaled, slow and measured, as though willing his composure back into place. But Jasmine knew better. She had spent her entire career studying the micro-reactions of powerful men. That fractional tightening around his mouth wasn't confidence. It was the look of someone realizing his authority might not be as bulletproof as he believed. The chairman tried to pivot to safer ground. "Justice Alito," he began, voice careful, "perhaps you'd like to clarify the nature of these engagements Representative Crockett referenced." But Alito didn't speak. He only lifted his chin fractionally and rested both hands on the table, as though daring someone else to ask. And Jasmine, who had already closed her folder, did something no one expected. She spoke again. "I'd like to add one final observation," she said, her voice clear but gentler than before. "Because I think there's something here bigger than donations or retreats or even the credibility of this court." The room stilled. "When people watch these proceedings," she said, her gaze sweeping the crowd and the cameras beyond it, "they're not really looking for spectacle. They're looking for evidence that this system is capable of holding itself accountable." She looked straight into Alito's eyes. "And when they see you act like these questions are beneath you, you're not just hurting yourself. You're telling every American who can't buy access that their faith in justice is misplaced." Her words fell into the chamber like pebbles into deep water, soft at first, then expanding in ripples no one could stop. Alito's jaw flexed, but still, he said nothing. Jasmine didn't flinch. She let her hands rest lightly on the table, her posture relaxed in a way that made the contrast between them impossible to ignore. He looked cornered, she looked resolute. "This isn't personal," she repeated, her voice dropping just enough that it felt intimate, like a confidence shared with millions of strangers. "This is structural. This is about whether the institutions we rely on to protect us are willing to live by the same principles they expect the rest of us to obey." And then she did finally go quiet, folding her hands in her lap. The hush in the room was absolute. For the first time, it wasn't just that Justice Alito wouldn't answer. It was that no one believed any answer he could give would matter more than the truth Jasmine had just laid bare. A clerk stepped forward to collect the stack of documents Jasmine had submitted for the record. The rustle of paper sounded thunderous in the quiet. Justice Alito stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the committee dais, as if by refusing to look at Jasmine, he could make her vanish. But she was still there, unmoved, unbowed, and watching him with a calm that felt almost surgical. The chairman shifted uncomfortably. "If there are no further questions." "There's one more," Jasmine said, her voice so soft that everyone instinctively leaned in. Alito's jaw tightened. Jasmine didn't open the folder again. She didn't need to. This wasn't about paperwork anymore. "You've written opinions about the moral failings of the poor," she began, her tone steady, "about how government support creates dependency, about how people must be held responsible for the choices that led them to desperation." She paused, letting the memory of those words bloom in the minds of every person watching. "So here's my question," she continued, her eyes locked on his. "If a single mother who made mistakes can be denied mercy because character matters, why should a Supreme Court justice who hid relationships and gifts be treated like he's above reproach?" Alito finally turned to look at her, and Jasmine thought she saw something flicker behind his practiced stoicism, something that looked an awful lot like shame. She didn't let him look away. "Is your integrity worth less because you wear a robe?" she asked, her voice as calm as ever. "Or is it supposed to be worth more?" No one in the gallery so much as shifted in their seats. Even the reporters had stopped taking notes, too spellbound to look away. When Alito didn't answer, Jasmine inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the silence as its own kind of confession. "I thought so," she murmured. The chairman's gavel came down again, a hollow punctuation mark that did nothing to restore the room's equilibrium. The next representative cleared his throat and attempted to reframe the hearing, but every word sounded trivial after what had just happened. "And Jasmine," she simply sat back, folding her hands again. She didn't look triumphant. She looked resolved. Because this wasn't about scoring points or making headlines. It was about reminding the most powerful judge in the country that no title was big enough to swallow the truth forever. And for one crystalline moment, every person in the chamber believed it. It was a moment that would replay on every news broadcast before the day was over. Not because Jasmine Crockett had raised her voice, she hadn't, but because she had refused to lower it, even by a fraction. The next representative tried to steer the conversation back to neutral ground, abstract legal theories, decades-old precedents. But the attempt landed flat. The temperature of the room had changed. Alito sat there, rigid and wordless, his gaze trained on the far wall as if he could bore a hole through it with sheer will. But no amount of practiced detachment could erase the image of Jasmine's questions hanging in the air like an indictment. In the back, a young woman in a navy suit, an aide no one would remember by name, clutched her phone to her chest and whispered, "She actually did it." Because everyone knew, no one was supposed to confront a Supreme Court justice like that. No one was supposed to say out loud that integrity is either universal or meaningless. And Jasmine had just done both. She waited until the next question droned to a close, then leaned forward one last time. "Justice Alito," she said, her voice steady, "I don't expect you to answer me now. But I do expect you to consider that when history looks back on this moment, it won't remember how carefully you avoided the question. It'll remember that you were asked." He looked at her then. Really looked. And for a split second, the mask slipped. She saw it, the unmistakable glint of recognition that she wasn't just another lawmaker reading from prepared remarks. She was a reminder he couldn't swat away. "You've spent your career defining what is proper and what is improper," she continued quietly. "But the real measure of character is how you act when someone finally holds up a mirror." The chamber had gone still again, the same oppressive hush that had followed every one of her statements. Jasmine drew a slow breath. "I'm not here to humiliate you," she said. "I'm here because the public deserves to know whether the people entrusted with their rights can be trusted themselves." Her gaze swept the committee one last time. "And if you can't answer that question," she finished, her voice softer now, "then maybe you've already given us the answer." No one clapped. No one needed to. The power of the moment wasn't in the spectacle. It was in the truth, plain, unvarnished, undeniable. And Jasmine Crockett, without raising her voice, had just made sure no one in that room would ever forget it. The gavel came down one final time, but it sounded as tired as the chairman's voice. "Thank you, Representative Crockett," he managed, though it was clear he didn't quite know what else to say. Reporters began hurrying out the side doors, phones already held to their ears as they dictated the opening lines of stories that would run before sundown. Some of them looked back over their shoulders, as if to make sure Jasmine was real and not a projection of collective wish fulfillment, a leader unafraid to name the hypocrisy everyone else had tiptoed around. Justice Alito shifted in his chair. His hands, which had been folded so deliberately moments before, were now clasped tighter, the knuckles blanched white. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't even smile. She simply closed her folder with a final, quiet snap. There was nothing more to say. But before she could lean back, one last voice piped up, a junior congressman, his expression cautious. "Representative Crockett," he said, do you believe this hearing will lead to any accountability?" Jasmine turned her head, meeting his gaze across the horseshoe of polished wood. "I think accountability doesn't always look like a verdict," she replied evenly. "Sometimes it's just making sure the truth gets spoken out loud, so the people who pay the price for these decisions know they aren't crazy for wanting better." Her voice was calm, almost conversational, but every syllable carried the weight of something larger than a single hearing. "And if nothing else," she went on, "the next time someone says this court is above reproach, they'll have to reckon with the fact that someone dared to say, 'Prove it.'" A hush settled over the room one last time. For a moment, even Alito seemed to be listening, not to argue, but because there was nothing left to hide behind. Then Jasmine gathered her papers, rose without ceremony, and walked out past the cameras, her stride unhurried. Somewhere down the hall, a staffer whispered to another. She didn't just question him. "What do you mean?" the second asked. She dismantled the myth. And in 1,000 homes that night, when the clip played again and again, that was what people saw. Not a woman trying to score points. A woman willing to say what needed to be said, no matter how many people had been too afraid to say it first. By the time Jasmine reached the marble steps outside the hearing room, the hallway was already packed with journalists, staffers, and onlookers craning for a glimpse of her face. She didn't pause. She didn't look for the cameras. She just kept walking. Because the work wasn't finished, not even close. A reporter hurried alongside her, mic extended. "Congresswoman Crockett, do you think Justice Alito will respond publicly?" Jasmine didn't break stride. "That's up to him," she said evenly. "But the record is clear now. And the American people are smart enough to decide what it means." Another voice, breathless, "Do you have any regrets about how direct you were?" Jasmine finally stopped, just long enough to meet the reporter's eyes. "Regret?" She shook her head once, slow and certain. "The only thing I regret is how long it took someone in this building to ask the question." And then she was moving again, her aides flanking her like the wake behind a ship. Inside the chamber, Justice Alito sat alone at the table. The other committee members had begun to drift away, murmuring among themselves, some unwilling to meet his gaze. The cameras had stopped rolling. The spectacle was over. But the truth Jasmine had spoken wouldn't fade when the lights did. Because that's the thing about a myth, once you pierce it, no one can ever pretend it's whole again. And whether Alito liked it or not, today the myth of untouchable impartiality had been punctured in front of the entire country. Hours later, as the clip went viral, spreading across social feeds, cable news, and text chains, someone uploaded a caption that would be repeated everywhere by morning. Jasmine Crockett didn't come to play. She came to remind them who they serve. And in living rooms, break rooms, and classrooms, people watched her sit there, calm, unflinching, uncompromising, and they felt something rare. Not cynicism. Not defeat. But hope that sometimes, even in the highest halls of power, the truth can still have the last word. Jasmine Crockett didn't need to shout slogans or raise her voice to make the room listen. She just sat across from one of the most powerful judges in America and reminded everyone of a simple truth. We are watching you. And you will be held accountable. That day, Justice Alito's silence wasn't strength, it was a kind of confession. The confession of a man who realized, maybe for the first time, that his authority wasn't above question. Jasmine didn't bring those files and receipts to score a political point. She brought them because millions of Americans have spent years asking, who is justice really for? Maybe Alito will never apologize. Maybe the court will never willingly reform itself. But after today, the people saw something that can't be unseen. No title, no robe, no lifetime appointment can bury the truth forever. And one day, it only takes a single voice to bring down every wall built to keep the powerful safe from scrutiny.